Ladies and gents, it's a privilege to be together for this world exclusive interview with Roberta Naas, which is one of the legends of the watch media all around the world, not just USA. And I am saying, Roberta, thank you so much for this privilege you are giving to us and to all the readers around Europe and the globe to find out more insight about your life. Because, ladies and gents, she is celebrating no less than 40 years of reporting about watches and more. So, Roberta, I will ask you, obviously, as always, the first question. How did you start?
Okay. Well, first, I want to say thank you very much for having me and for talking with me on this subject of watches that I've dedicated, decades of my life to. And that wasn't intentional. My master's degree is in newspaper journalism from the Newhouse School, and I didn't come out expecting to write about watches. I came out expecting to write for newspapers, and cover all the news, which eventually I've done. But yeah, I mean, early on in the early mid 80s, I got a job with a trade publication in America called National Jeweler. There were 4 or 5 trade publications at that point in time, and this was one of the leader ones. And I was with them for a couple of years, maybe a year and a half. And the watch editor at the time was leaving. And he said, "Oh, you should take," everybody worked in beats. "You should take the watch beat." I wanted to do jewelry. But I talked to him about what he did, and it sounded fascinating. So I went into the editor-in-chief and I said, I want to be the watch editor. I know Norman's leaving. And it was a woman, and she said to me, "You can't. There's never been a female watch editor before."
Shame on you.
And this was 1984-ish. And at that time, the Japanese were way more important than the Swiss because we were still in the quartz era. And there was this feeling that the Japanese wouldn't accept a woman. So we didn't have the computers then that we have now. We didn't have Zoom. So I wrote a letter and I faxed it to the heads of some of the key companies in Japan, Seiko, Citizen, at the time Casio, Orient. And I said, I'm planning to be the next watch journalist at National Jeweler magazine, and I would love to come to Japan and interview you, but I need to interview the CEO. It has to be the top person. And these would be my questions. This would be what I'm looking for. Within 3 days, I faxed all of these letters. I had responses positively from every single one. And I went into the editor's office. I said, "Okay, now I'm your new watch editor." And my first trip was to Japan. So that's kind of, it wasn't, I wish I could say I have a love story with a certain watch, but that's not how it happened.
Tell me, Roberta, one thing. Usually, the passion for all of us, including myself, is starting as a child when your father, your mother, someone is giving you as a child a kind of watch, even it's plastic, doesn't matter. And that's always the start of the love affair with the watches. In your case, I understand it was not this case.
No, I did eventually get a few heirloom watches, including a stunning Bulova when my aunt passed away. But no, my love of watches really came when I was immersed in the industry. The people, I mean, people back then were such characters, such players, and it wasn't all corporate. Half of the brands that are now owned by Richemont weren't owned by Richemont. They were independent brands. Um, there was such a freedom, and it was the people, it was the industry, and it was the watches themselves that really made me fall in love with this industry. And once or twice I'd try to leave it, but I never could. It gets in your blood, but we all know that.
By the way, talking about Japan, how did you find the Japanese brands back then? We talk mid 80s.
Yeah. I wish I had thought to pull it out when I went to visit Citizen. Um, there was a Japanese magazine that photographed me, I guess, as the first woman watch editor from America coming to tour the factory. And I have pictures of myself in cap and gown and, all of the um, attire that you have to don before you walk into the dust-free areas. Um, I was young. I was impressionable. I had never been to a watch factory before, and I found it to be so high tech, just amazingly over the top high tech versus, tiny little hand individual production. I didn't have anything to compare it to then. It wasn't until a year later that when I finally went to Swiss factories that I realized what a world of difference they are. And I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did, because I was expecting back then the Japanese brands to be much more automated than anything else in Switzerland. That is correct,
Yes,
I
all
guess.
very industrial, very automated, very, even walking into the dust-free rooms, you stood in a room and had the air sprayed at you to make sure there wasn't even a particle of dust on the hat or the coats. And that was 40 years ago.
Before I will ask you what is the difference between 40 years ago and today for the Japanese, I'd ask you, and when you went back, let's call it like that, in Europe, visiting some Swiss manufacturers, what was your first impressions?
This may sound odd, but awe. I often, in my early days, would call the watch making facilities that I toured hallowed halls because everyone was so studious. They were working, everything was by hand, everything was individual. It still is, of course, but well, to some degree. But it was somewhat hallowed, magical. I remember one of the first tours I did early on in my career, and you have to understand, I was the first woman, so I would really had to break into this man's world, and so my trip invitations were fewer and far between until I proved myself. But one of the first ones I went to was Patek, and they didn't, today you think Patek Philippe and you see their big, beautiful manufacturer. I went into downtown Geneva to all the little individual ateliers that were all over the city where they were making the hands here, or they were making the dials here, or they were making movement parts here. It was fascinating because everything wasn't under one roof. And look at it today. It's all under one roof.
Actually, one thing we know, but you are a testimonial for this. How big was actually the way they did watches, not only in manufacturing, in terms of complications back then, let's say in Switzerland, compared with today, because we all know that the, let's call, complication mania came in 90s. So I wonder what kind of watches they did manufactured in crafted, let's call it even better, in the 80s in Switzerland.
I think by the time I was going in the late 80s and the early 90s, we were seeing those complications, but they didn't have nanotechnology. They didn't have as much CAD as we have now. And they were really building minute repeaters and tourbillons and even automatons. Some of the early Ulysse Nardin automatons were just phenomenal. And everything was just being carved. It's sort of like when you go into a dial manufacturer today and people are still actually hand painting. And, if you're doing guilloche or miniature painting or lacquer, everything was really hand done. And it still is, but it was a different level.
I would say also a different scale.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. They were
You
turning
know,
out
I,
minimum numbers of those pieces back then.
do you remember, by the way, some figures from the 80s? How big was the production of Swiss watchmaking industry, roughly?
I really don't remember those numbers. Funny, I've done a lot of reports on it over the years, but that's taxing my brain 40 years now. But definitely not as not even on scale to what we are today.
From my studies, because I was digging a little bit, I learned that it was really, compared to today, was practically an incredibly small numbers. And no matter if we talk about big names like Patek, even Rolex, back then was not really, stable made. It was not really. And when we see today that the millions and billions of Swiss francs as an export, you know, to me it's impressive. And sometimes when I see people from the industry being not happy with the results, I wonder because why they are so unhappy. And someone like you with 4 decades of activity you can tell them, guys, I was a person involved in this industry from the beginning, so don't complain. You don't know nothing about history. So am I wrong or am I right?
It's true. And I've watched so many wonderful brands close their doors, die out. I mean, even Universal Genève and ones that are now we're seeing Urban Jurgensen, some of the brands being revived. Well, I remember when they were here and in America, different definitely than Europe. Back then, you had a distributor. Brands didn't have offices here predominantly. They had a distributor who would distribute this brand, this brand, this brand, 4 or 5 brands, and travel around America to try to sell to retailers. The scale was just so different, so tiny. You had it was really a jeweler's business back then. There were no brand stores. Um, and everything from exports and imports to retail jewelry sales. It was just so totally different. And it has grown. I mean, it has, despite all those brands that did go out of business, we've had so many more brands obviously come into the market. And of course, we've had the growth of all of the groups buying brand after brand.
Last question regarding the 80s. It was a time when Nicolas Duhaig, the senior, was rescuing the whole industry. And I know you met so many people, including the late Hayek. Tell a little bit about your own experience in interviewing, discussing with him about the industry and about the revolution he was doing practically, reshaping the industry in Switzerland.
That's an interesting question. It's funny, but now your questions are making me really reflect back to the times where I was witnessing history in the making. Maybe we all
Exactly.
are today to some degree, but I witnessed some of the most important evolutions in our industry, and I met some of the best players. I mean, I've met Gerald Genta over and over again, and I'm so fortunate. I always say I'm blessed, and I really believe that. But to go back to Nick Hayek Sr., the very first time I met him was in his office in Switzerland. I had flown over for a few different things, and they had sent me documents ahead of time about him, and it wasn't by computer. Everything was different then, um, and articles about him. And so when I got into his office and I met him, he said to me, "Did you read everything that was sent to you about me?" And I said, "No." And he looked at me and he started ranting. "Why would you not read all of these things? Why would you not have looked at this? You should have an idea of who I am." And so I just sat there. And when he got done, I said, "I have an idea of who you are, but I don't want to have everybody else's idea of who you are. So therefore, I did not read anybody's articles about you because I wanted to form my own impressions." And he looked at me, he said, "Oh, I like that answer. Sit down and start the interview." And so we always had a great rapport after that. But he had a vision. I mean, he really knew what he had to do. I don't know that he said save the industry, but he knew what he had to do to bring it all back together, to keep it all alive. And he did it. And you know, people can say maybe there were mistakes made, maybe some people didn't get full credit for what they did within the Swatch group, but the man saved the Swiss watch world. So there's no getting around that. And he did have a lot of helpers, and maybe some didn't get as much attention as they should. But here we are today. So I don't know if I answered your
Talking
question.
about personalities, because as you mentioned already, part of Nick Hayek Senior, but you mentioned Gerald Genta. So about all these personalities, tell us a little bit about the ones who made a big impression on you.
I was very impressionable. I would say in the 90s, I had already been smitten. I mean, I had already fallen in love with, especially the US people. As I mentioned before, I had to break down doors in the US. We'll go back to that because the people were not easy on me. But the personalities, they're what drew me in because there wasn't corporate PR around. There weren't people saying, don't say this, don't say that. You said what you wanted to say.
You are a
Um,
journalist.
yeah, but all of the executives did too. Nobody wasn't allowed to talk to you. It was you picked up the phone and you'd call, I don't know, the head of Audemars Piguet and say, "Hey, can you talk to me for a few minutes? I want to discuss this." Yeah, okay. Um, so the accessibility was just beyond belief. Um, but who were the personalities? Definitely Gerald Genta. I mean, some people don't even know what Basel World is today, but or isn't, but was. But I remember Basel before it even grew, before it even became the big, huge hall it was. And Hall One was still the important hall. It was still where Patek and Rolex and the big guys were. But then there were also so many little brands. And there, stuck on a corner, tucked right by the escalator, was Gerald Genta. And I'm going down the escalator one day and I'm looking in his booth thinking, wow. I went in, I introduced myself. We met, we talked, we had a ritual. Every year I would go in and I would spend a few hours with him, and he was, maybe not a few hours, maybe an hour. It was Basel. He was like a kid in the candy store. He loved his watches. He showed them with such pride and such enthusiasm, and he had fun with it. So yeah, he always impressed me as somebody that just had a good time with design. So he was a big one. Jean-Claude Biver. I mean, I met him, wow, I would say even before he launched Blancpain again. You know, he's just always been a dynamic personality in everything he's done, and he makes an impression. And I could go and talk with him at any point in time. I still can. It's a great thing to be able to pick up the phone and talk to him, and or run into him and chat. So now of course Nick Hayek was his own person. And there were people back then that aren't around now. Ernst Tomke, who did in fact work with the Swatch Group. Oh, I don't know. I think I could go on and on. I had the chance to meet with so many of the watchmakers themselves because many of them were there at the booths in Basel. This is before even SIHH, now, of course, Watches and Wonders Geneva started. So it's just been pretty phenomenal. I knew Max Busser when he used to work at Harry Winston and before. So
Tell me a little bit about the way you perceived watches, 80s and 90s compared to today. Today, sometimes, that's my humble observation, sometimes it's just a competition for the number of complication on a watch. If you don't have 20 or 25, you cannot compete for the most complicated watch. And I know from Philippe Dufour that back then, 25 years ago, was not at all like that. Having a Grand Sonnerie was already a huge achievement for the watch industry. But again, you passed all this period of time. So from your perspective, how do you compare this complication, I can call it, market?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, there's such a dichotomy between what it was and what it is for so many reasons. In the late 80s, early 90s, we saw two different types of watches. Lots of the beautiful little small 34 millimeter, 36 millimeters were still floating around. So that return to the past, I've seen so many returns to the past. And then you had the larger, maybe 40 millimeters. Nicer, a complication like a tourbillon or a repeater or an automaton. But the scale was so much smaller. If they had 4 or 5 in their lineup total watches with complications, that was a lot because these took so much time and effort to create, to build. Then by the late 90s, we started seeing the bigger watches and the bigger complications. And of course, once we got all of the technology and the CNC machines and everything to really do what we can do today on mass production levels, even if they're not mass production, the complications changed. And yes, there has become sort of this who has the most complicated watch in the world mentality, but I think a lot of that depends on the brand, because I think that some brands are just trying to beat a record. Other brands are really just trying to do better, to do more and to do it because it's a beautiful thing to do. Yeah. So complications today are so much more prevalent. If you own a tourbillon from years past, I don't know. I would love to go talk to one of the auction houses a little bit about how their values compare to a tourbillon from, say, 2020. Because you have perhaps what we would call better, more reliable technology in today's watches, but as compared to maybe back then, but the craftsmanship and hand workmanship was so different. So, yeah.
Roberta, another question is coming because, again, you are the right person to talk. This kind of discussion, you can call it dilemma between quartz watches and mechanical watches. You passed all the times, all the period of times when we all remember it was like, okay, forget about mechanical watches, the quartz watches will be the dominant. Nowadays, we know that still, in terms of numbers, the quartz watches are by far outnumber the others. Still, today we all understand that mechanical watches are extremely important for the watchmaking. So, how do you see this kind of discussion between quartz and mechanical? It's worth to discuss, or it's simply, I don't know, wrong discussion?
I don't know. I think a lot of that depends on who you're talking to. We in our watch world, we're a microcosm of collectors and passionate watch lovers, and we know all of this. We know why a mechanical watch might be better or why a quartz watch might be preferable. But I think when you look at the world in general out there, and I look at it from an American viewpoint, other than a few really great friends who are collectors, the majority of people I see on the streets or I see when I walk into a retail store don't even ask, is it quartz or mechanical? And most of them want a quartz watch because they don't have to play with resetting it if the power runs out, or if they lay it down for 5 days, they don't have to reset it, rewind it, whatever they have to do. So I feel like the quartz versus mechanical discussion really is one that revolves around who we're talking to. So within our watch world, does it matter? In the era that I was in the industry, of course it mattered. It was the overshadowing monster in the room because so many mechanical brands were dying, and is quartz going to end us? Then there became this sort of happy medium. And to this day, I think that all of the best brands have that mixture of both the quartz and mechanical because they know which brands they need, which customers they need to cater to with which type of watch. Is it relevant? Absolutely, it's relevant in our world. I can argue the virtues of both, so can anybody. But in the end, right, it's a personal choice. And yeah, so I think there'll always be room. I mean, even when everybody panicked about the smartwatch, and is this the new quartz? No, but there's definitely a wearer for it. There's a wearer for both, and some of the same wearers wear both. I think today with solar powered watches and the technology available to maybe be cleaner, I think that's another realm of movement that's important. But they're only going to be niche markets. In the end, it's going to be the quartz and the mechanical.
By the way, that you already asked two questions which I was planning to ask you.
Oh, sorry, I talk too much. You should say stop.
I'm glad. Yeah, no, I like that. Still talking about smartwatches and connected watches which is really the name of today. What do you think about the big time, big money, big amounts of connected watches coming from the IT giants like Apple, for instance? Do you think is a fair competition? Because obviously, even Rolex has no chance, not even a slightest chance to compete with Apple. We all know that. So somehow, what do you think from your perspective of a watch lover? This is a fair competition, or the way it is, that's life on the planet. Everybody is free to make a choice. What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think the watch industry can't compete with the Apples and the Garmins and even the Casio, who has the technology behind their big corporate parent. They're always probably going to make the more advanced, technologically speaking, watch, Citizen, because they have their parent company with all of that technology. Granted, there are companies that have made great inroads, like if you look at Tag Heuer, their connected watch, and they've made a lot of inroads with their own software. But I think that world really belongs more to the tech giants. Somebody out there is going to definitely yell at me for that.
I can see that.
And what do people want that watch for? They want it for the technology it can offer. So, I think watch people, it's great that we have connected watches coming from the watch world. I think it's important that we have that. It's important that we're able to communicate that our industry is always growing and evolving. But it comes down to the customer.
Talking about sustainable watches, you already mentioned, that was my second question. You already stole my question. But anyway, coming back to that, because it's really interesting. How do you what is your interpretation of a sustainable watch? Obviously, having solar energy, which is an impressive achievement, to be honest. But beyond that, how do you regard this sustainable watches? Because there is a long, long, long discussion in the industry if it's worth talking or not.
I think solar movements, solar powered movements, movements that harness our environment to work or to have an aesthetic look are very important. I think it's sort of like in watchmaking of every era that I've witnessed, of every decade, the brands embrace the culture around them. They embrace society around them. They embrace whatever the movement is that's around them. And so I think we're doing that as well now that sustainability has become so important. I think that there are some standout watches out there. I love what Ulysse Nardin has done with its diver net. I just think that when the brands are being smart enough to use some of these sustainable products, I actually like Oris's the Volante, the deer strap. I think when they're doing it in a way that they can incorporate it and that it has a message, we all love storytelling. I think that resonates with certain consumers, and I think it's a really important part of the watch conversation today.
As we are approaching the end of our conversation, let me ask you which are your favorite, not watches, because it will be difficult, but which are your favorite topics, chapters of the watch making industry you want to deal with, you are focused on, you love to immerse in them?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think I'm fascinated by the artistic side of watches. I'm fascinated by the people who can reinterpret, I don't know, a Monet painting onto a tiny piece of porcelain that's an inch and a half in diameter. And undergoes so many firings and so many paintings. And I know what that takes. My mother painted on china when I was a child. I could come in and smell the kill and know what color she was painting with. Um, so I love that aspect. I love the fact that the watch world brings together so many artistic métiers, from gem setting to sculpting. You know, you look at the beautiful sculpted panthers and on Cartier watches, and I just think that that's such an important thing because it brings the history of the world together with the history of watchmaking and makes such an important statement. I also love the beauty and the craftsmanship of a mechanical movement that is complicated. I could listen to a minute repeater all day. I could watch an automaton, especially the Ulysse Nardin, maybe the jungle safari with the tiger in it and the paws moving, or something from Jacques Atreau. It takes such a mindset for a watchmaker to figure out how to make all of these parts move, even the astronomical complications. So I'm going on and on, but to answer your questions, the aspects and the parts of what I love about watchmaking is really the hand craftsmanship, the workmanship, the thought process. It boggles my mind to think that one or two or three watchmakers can spend years building a single watch. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Coming back to you personally, what do you say, consider as the key three, let's say, most important accomplishments of your 40 decades of reporting about watches?
Me personally,
Yep.
being the first woman watch journalist in America, being able to break down doors. There were times meetings were held in men's clubs in New York City that women weren't allowed in, and I would stand outside. I would stand outside for hours waiting for one or two or three of the watch executives to come outside so I could say, what did you discuss in there? Keeping my ethics and my integrity intact. I think I've opened doors for many other women. So I feel like that's probably one of my biggest accomplishments. Certainly I've written a half a dozen books on watches. I feel like I've pretty much become a historian on the watch world. So I feel like that's a big accomplishment. And I think the third one is really just me staying me. You know, as much as I love what I do, I don't think there's anybody out there who would say that I've changed. Maybe I've become more experienced, of course, in this world, but um, I've stayed true to who I am and what I believe in, and I've stayed true to keeping everything on a level of being a good person. So,
One last question is, how do you see yourself in your career, in your activities dedicated to watches? I will not say in the next 40 years, but let's say 10 to 20 years.
well, I think after 40 years in this industry, I think my real next plan is I've started reshaping a little bit of who I'm working with. And I think my next steps would be to go into to watch books again. I think I'd like to write a few brand specific books. I have some general topic watch books I'd like to write. And then when I'm done with that, I have some children's books I want to write, and I even have a screenplay I want to write. So my next 10 or 20 years are
It's
full.
already full booked, fully booked. Fantastic. So, Roberta, once again, thank you very much for this absolutely interesting and impressive, I would say, interview. Thank you for accepting to have an out-of-the-box discussion, not the typical, let's say, discussion you see in many interviews. I am honored that you accepted to be as crazy as I am in discussing freely about this kind of topics. And
Sorry.
I want just to thank you once again to accept becoming a jury member of the Temporis International Awards, which is the Golden Globes of the global watchmaking, as you nicknamed us, and now it's our official slogan, official mantra. It's exactly who we are. Thank you very much once again.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a jury member. I thoroughly enjoy the process, and thank you for asking me to sit here and talk with you, because I mean, it's a wonderful thing to do and to be off topic, and I've just really enjoyed it. So thank you.